Hey everybody, welcome back to Web Inspect. I am Timothy Miller, your host, and today is Minutiae Monday, where we talk about a small thing that has to do with web development that might just make a big difference. And today we're going to go back into CSS and we're going to talk about CSS variables. Now, CSS variables are somewhat unique in the web community in that people have talked about them and people have talked about wanting them and people have talked about how nice they would be to use for pretty much over a decade now. It's probably been closer to 2 decades, actually. Pretty much as long as CSS has been a thing, people have been asking for CSS variables. And people have even gone to the extent of building giant frameworks and tools that simply add variables to CSS, like SASS and less. Those things originally came from the want to have to repeat yourself less in your code. It comes from a very well-known programming principle called DRY, D-R-Y, which stands for don't repeat yourself, and that all good programmers don't. Well, I mean, that's not true. A lot of good programmers repeat themselves all the time. But ideally, in a perfect world, you don't repeat yourself on any important pieces of functionality that should always be the same. So people have wanted CSS variables for a long time, and SASS and less came out of that want for less repetition in CSS. And that's why the vast majority of people who write CSS, like I do, work in SASS and less these days. If you go look up the Stack Overflow developer survey, and you can see back through the years that more and more people have started using SASS and less people have written vanilla CSS. And variables are a really big reason why. Now, you might wonder why we don't have CSS variables, why people have wanted them for 15, 20 years now, and we've never gotten them. And there are a few really good reasons for that. Part of it is just the complexity of the project. There's a lot more that goes into adding something like this to browsers than you and I think about. CSS variables were a very difficult challenge to implement without breaking stuff. And in fact, there are still some problems with them that no one has been able to solve. And we're going to talk about those problems a little bit, and then we're going to dive into how you actually use them and whether you should actually use them. And yeah, that's what's on the agenda for today. So let's jump into it. So if we pull up a quick search of CSS variables here on DuckDuckGo, you can see already that there's some controversy here. You can see one of the top articles here is CSS variables are a bad idea. And it's good for you to go in here and to search through these and to get these different perspectives. Aaron here argues that they're a bad idea because they break backwards compatibility. So browsers from the beginning, a very important thing to web browser developers is that when they push updates to their browser, it doesn't break existing websites from years back. So the first websites that ever worked in Netscape Navigator and in Internet Explorer version 3 and all of those super old browsers, all of the websites that were developed for that, they still basically work. And you can actually go look up the original first website and it still looks just like it did 30 years ago. So this idea of every step we take forward, we don't leave anyone behind is a really good, important point of what makes the web work and what has made the web work for so long. And that's what Aaron here is arguing, is that it's not worth breaking that backwards compatibility to implement CSS variables. And he talks about how they break that compatibility. And this is a good article to read. I'll put it down below if you want to see it. But there are plenty of other people who argue that it is worth breaking a little bit of backwards compatibility to be able to have these variables moving forward. And in fact, because of the update cycles of the web, things actually are not broken for very long when we push new things these days. You can see that CSS variables, they haven't been a thing for very long, but they already have support almost across the board. The one exception being IE, which is not getting any updates anymore because the Microsoft team is working on Edge now. But Edge supports variables, Firefox supports variables, Chrome, Safari, they're not even prefixed. They're all good to go. You're good to use variables as far as these browsers are concerned. So that's the good side. And you can look at your analytics, and if you don't see any IE traffic or very minimal IE traffic, then you can go ahead and use variables. There's really not going to be much downside for you. But the big downside is that there really isn't a great way to do fallbacks for these variables. And I'll show you a good way to do fallbacks, but it it requires a non-trivial amount of extra work. So we'll look at that. But for the time being, we're going to talk just briefly about why they're useful and how to use them. And then you can dig into your website data and figure out if they would be worth using for you. So I want to first show you this little example from Wes Bos that shows you essentially at a glance why CSS variables are useful. And this is why they're useful independent of SASS variables. There are a lot of things that you can do with SASS variables that CSS variables really aren't better at than SASS, but there are a few things that CSS variables can do that SASS cannot, because SASS is a build program. So you write the variables and then it builds it into one CSS file, and that's what you actually ship. So that CSS file, after you ship it, it's not changing at all. Whereas CSS variables can change on the fly. They can change dynamically on the page depending on what you ask them to do. So this is just a little JavaScript here that when you drag these sliders, it changes those CSS variables. And you can see this is something that you cannot do with SASS variables because they can't change on the page like this. And where this gets really useful is when you apply this color to other things on the page. So if we change this color here, it updates this header, it updates the box, it updates this link, and that's where CSS variables really shine through. If you don't need any sort of dynamic functionality like this, then for the time being, it's probably safer to just use SASS variables. But if you do have like dynamic themes that you want updated on your site, then maybe it will be worth it to you to use CSS variables. There's another really good example of this in this article by Rob Dodson, CSS variables, why should you care? This is also a very good argument in favor of them. It's also a very good article to read that supports the other direction from the article we were just looking at. And he has an example down here at the bottom that I'll show you real quick. And it's very similar to the Wes Bos example I just showed you, but you can see you can also affect layout things. So you can affect your spacing, like margins and paddings and stuff. You can affect columns, margins. This could also be really good responsively, where as you change the width of your browser, you can change different variables that affect different parts of the page all the way down, which could be very useful to, again, not have to repeat yourself in a bunch of different arbitrary spots. So how do we actually do this? Let me show you a quick example. So we're going to open a new pin here. I'm just going to toss some buttons in here. All right, so I've got HTML for just a couple buttons here. Now I'm just going to toss a couple of quick styles in. All right, guys, so you can see here I've got two buttons. And let me add a cursor here too. And so I've got these two buttons, and they both have the same styling. Now I've also got an additional class on the second button using BIM syntax that gives it a red modifier. So I'm going to add a class for that red modifier. Now traditionally the way you would do this is you would just come in here and you would say border color red, right? And it changes the border to red. But the problem with this is all of the other styles are still overwriting this on hover and focus. This is a pain point that I run into all the time, where I essentially have to copy a whole bunch of styles for hover and focus effects as well as the base styles, and then just change the few things that I need changed. This is where CSS variables comes in handy. So here's how you change this to CSS variables. The things we want to change is we want the border color to change based on this modifier. We also want the background color to change when we're hovering. And that's really all we need to change. So we've got these two colors, color black, and that's essentially what we want to turn into a CSS variable. So we'll do var parentheses. This is how you use a variable in CSS. And we'll do btn color, which will be the name of our variable. And then we want to set up a default style for this button. And our default style will be that black style. So we'll use a fallback color, which is black, and everything after the first comma is your fallback. So btn color, it will use this variable. If this variable is not there, then it will use black. And we'll just do the same thing down here. So we've got our CSS variables in there. Now, all we have to do is down here in this class, instead of doing border red, we can just define a variable. So we do dash dash btn color red. And just like that, you can see the border is already red and our hover style is also red. So this is a much cleaner way of setting this up than actually redefining all of your focus styles and all of your main styles. It's just a much nicer way to look at this, and it helps you avoid repeating yourself. It helps you only set the things that you need to change. Now, we already talked about support for CSS variables, and it's a little bit tricky because here's the thing. Older browsers, when they see this, if they don't know what CSS variables are, they're just going to ignore this line. And if they ignore this line, they're also ignoring this line. And if they're ignoring that line, they're ignoring this line. And you end up with all of your main styles not working on older browsers. And that is one of the main arguments against CSS variables and why they are probably one of the riskier things that you can use in CSS. So let me real quickly show you a way to make sure that your web page still functions for people who have older browsers. This is called progressive enhancement. It's a very important concept in web development, something that you pretty much always have to think about when you're building web pages. So let me show you a real quick way to use fallbacks. And this is also another important concept in CSS and fairly new, is using @supports. It looks like this. You use an @ sign and you type supports, and then in the parentheses, you put whatever CSS you aren't sure if it supports. So we'll just do btn color red. We'll put that up here. And what this tells the browser is if you understand how to interpret this, then you can go ahead and use the code below. Otherwise, just skip it. So we're just going to cut this block of code out of here, put this here. And then one other thing we need to do, we need to move all of these var statements down there. So we'll just do that real quick. All right, we're back, guys, and as you can see, all of this code now works without having variables. So if your browser doesn't support variables, all of these buttons will just show up as the black version, which isn't the end of the world. And then down here, we just add the bits that aren't supported in browsers that don't support variables. So you can see we've got the button class, we're using the variables in both those spots, and then we're setting the variable there. So guys, again, if you want to start using CSS variables, just be sure you consider the upsides and the downsides. And if you're using them for a case like this, honestly, you don't need to use them. I'm already using SASS here. I could have used SASS variables to do exactly the same thing and to get exactly the same benefits, but they are a really good thing to have in your tool belt for the future, something that you need to know and you need to learn about if you don't want to get left behind. There you go, guys. There's a little primer on CSS variables and a little perspective on whether or not they will be useful for you. There's only so much mileage you can get out of them at this point in 2018, but for the time being, it's just a good thing to have in your head, a good thing to think about as you continue to build projects, and hopefully it'll come in useful for you one of these days. So guys, this was another Minutia Monday. Give us a thumbs up if you like what we're doing here, and we will see you again next week. Remember, guys, web development is hard. It's always growing, always expanding. It's always too big for all of our minds, but you can do it. You're smart enough. You have what it takes, and we'll be back later this week with some more knowledge for you. So we'll talk to you later. Bye.